All right, before I jump into this video, I want you to head down to the comments and answer the question, do you think that an ND filter reduces the harshness of light? Let me know down in the comments. Don't stop this video though. Let it play because I need that duration. Let it play, but head down to the comments and let me know your prediction. Does it make a difference or does it not make a difference? Let me know. Let's get into it. When it comes to ND filters, as photographers, we like to say it's like putting sunglasses in front of a lens. And that makes sense because the purpose of an ND filter is to basically block some of the light that's going through the lens and hitting the sensor, the same way we put sunglasses on to block the light that's hitting our eyeballs. Now with that, people often will say that an ND filter helps to reduce the harshness of the light or the intensity of the light. And I can understand why people would say that, because when we put sunglasses on, it does kind of make everything seem smooth and silky, if that makes sense. It obviously brings down the exposure, and there's just something about how the scene looks when we have sunglasses. The highlights seem more smooth, everything just seems a little different. So I can understand why people would say that. But in this video, I want to dispel that myth. An ND filter does not reduce glare. It does not reduce the harshness of the light, the harshness in the highlights. It doesn't reduce the intensity of light. It simply is cutting the exposure. It's dropping the exposure. It's reducing the amount of light that is able to hit the sensor. So in this video, I'm gonna bring the mannequin out in a minute. Didn't bring it out right now because there's people walking around. I didn't want them to think I was crazy out here in the middle of the desert with a mannequin. But what I'm gonna do to illustrate this is I'm going to take a picture of the mannequin, and as you can see, it's middle of the day, so I wanted to come out when there's a lot of harsh light. So I'm gonna take a picture of the mannequin with an ND filter, and then I'm going to take the same picture of the mannequin, removing the ND filter and increasing the shutter speed to get the same exposure. And what you're going to see is that there's not going to be any difference in the image. It's going to look the same. The highlights are going to be the same. Everything is going to be the same. So the reality is, when people use ND filters and it appears that it is reducing this harshness in the highlights, really what's happening is the exposure is just lower. So if you didn't have an ND filter and instead of exposing for the correct exposure per se, if you just drop that down one stop or two stops, you're going to get the same look. The ND filter in and of itself is not doing that. It's just a matter of your exposure being down. And because you have a lower exposure, one of two things are going to happen. One, either your highlights aren't going to appear as bright, so they won't seem as harsh, or number two, in lowering that exposure, you're not overexposing those highlights and therefore they don't appear as bright and as harsh. But in both cases, the ND filter isn't doing anything to the harshness of the light. It's simply bringing down the exposure. So enough talking, let's get to the example. All right, so here we have the images side by side. The image on the left was with the ND filter. The image on the right was without the ND filter. So if I zoom in and we look at the highlights, as you can see, they are exactly the same. There is no difference. They look exactly the same. The hotspot here, the specular highlights here, they are exactly the same. Again, the one on the left, ND filter, the one on the right without the ND filter. We come to this area here, it's exactly the same. There's no differences. If we come to this hotspot here, it's exactly the same, no differences. We come down here, look at the hotspots here, they're exactly the same. And if we come, even kind of in this area here, if we want to look at just kind of the more natural highlight, that's the same. If we come down here and look, this is the same. I mean, everywhere in this image, you are seeing the same thing. There is nothing different about the highlights. The image with the ND filter, these highlights are not any less intense. They are equal in specularity and intensity. There is no difference. And as a matter of fact, if I were to put these side by side and just say, pick which one had the ND filter and which one had it without, it would be a pure guess on your part as to which one was which. I'm going to create a virtual copy. If I can remember how to create a virtual copy. Yeah, create a virtual copy. Okay, so now we have two of the same, and I'm going to take this one here and I'm going to drop the exposure by 1 stop. Now, when I do that and I come back and we go and compare, now you can see that if we look at that highlight looks a lot less intense, right? It looks more smooth. We're not seeing the flare that we're seeing over at this one. If I come up here, this looks smoother. Everything about this image just feels more smooth, more silky, like I had mentioned at the beginning of the video. And hopefully that makes sense because I keep saying it, but I think you can understand with what I'm saying. This highlight obviously looks much better than this highlight over here. But the only difference between the two images is that the exposure was brought down. So when it comes to the ND filter, when you're getting this effect of it reducing the harshness of the highlights and reducing that specularity, it's not because the ND filter is doing that. It's simply because the exposure is down and you don't have the exposure to the same level as without the ND filter. So as you can see, if we take this image and we simply bring the exposure down, we're going to get that effect of things not seeming as harsh and everything being smooth. Even the transition from, the specular highlight here to just the regular highlight on the face, it seems smoother. And you would think that the ND filter is doing that, but in reality, it's just an exposure difference. So over here on this one, there's parts of this, if we go back, if I go into the develop here and go back to this one, you can see that, we're approaching almost being blown out. Now it's not quite blown out, but if you look over here, down in this area here at the percentages, you can see that, we're hovering around 95, 96. So this is not quite blown out, but it's pretty close. Whereas if we come over here to the one where I brought it down, now we're more in the low 80s, upper 70 range. So you can see that the exposure is down, and because that exposure is down, it gives the appearance of that highlight seeming much more smooth. But again, it's not the ND filter, it's just a matter of the exposure being less. Now, in terms of the adjustments that I made to the images, let me start with the one without the ND filter first. Now, when it comes to ND filters, I used a 6-stop ND filter. And of course, ND filters aren't an exact science. So it's 6 stops, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly 6 stops. So I started with the ND filter and I got that exposure, and then I simply increased the shutter speed 6 stops. So I wasn't trying to balance it on location. I simply raised it 6 stops. And in doing so, I had to bring the exposure down on the one without the ND filter by 0.09, so a little under 1/10 of a stop, just to get the exposures to be the same. Because again, I wanted to make sure that the exposure was level, so that way there wouldn't be this appearance of an exposure difference that would make you think that there was some sort of difference. So I did that, and then I adjusted the white balance by using the eye, and I did that on both images to get the white balance to be quote unquote balanced. So that was the adjustments that I made to that one. When it comes to the one with the ND filter, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, most ND filters, even your good ones, they're going to have some sort of color cast, and they can impact the white balance. That's just the reality of it. So to accommodate that, I had to adjust the white balance and the tint to be able to get it to be where it needed to be. And also, because I'm using an ND filter and I had an ND filter on top of a UV filter, because I'm just lazy and didn't want to take the other one off, there was vignetting. So I had to adjust for the vignetting as well. So in the lens corrections, I did adjust for the vignetting as well. So if I toggle this one, you can see that the corners here are heavily vignetted and the color is a little bit different. But if you look at the mannequin, as I toggle the two, nothing changes on the mannequin. So those adjustments had zero impact on the mannequin minus the color. There was a shift in tint. So the color is different, but outside of that, it's exactly the same. So I just was removing that extra vignette that was caused by the filter. So those were the things that I changed. They had no impact on what I've talked about in this video, but I wanted to be transparent and say, yes, I did make some adjustments to get the images more balanced and equal to show this. So there you have it. For more tips and tricks, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. And on your way out the door, go ahead and smash that thumbs up button for me. Help your boy out. Thank you very much for watching this video, and until the next one, take care.